how does godlessness affect God's people? Let's read the text first, and then I want to talk about godlessness a little bit. Joel 1, 1 through 4, the word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh, that came to Joel, son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders. Listen, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell your children about it, and let your children tell their children and their children to the next generation. What the devouring locust has left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the young locust has eaten. And what the young locust has left, the destroying locust has eaten. And so godlessness has brought upon the people of Israel a judgment. And it's a judgment of locusts that we're seeing here. And the reason that they have this judge of locusts is because of, as I said, godlessness. Now, godlessness, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Israelites have abandoned the worship of God. And in fact, in this text, abandon the worship of God in favor of other gods. It doesn't necessarily mean that. And in this text, it almost definitely doesn't. See, the prophet Joel wrote after what we call the exile. So the Jews had been punished or disciplined by God. They were taken into exile. They were taken out of the land of Israel. And they were in the land of Babylon for 70 years. And then Babylon was taken over by Persia, and the Persian Empire let them go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so the exile was all about the worship of foreign gods. Now, when they returned to Jerusalem, they did not return to largely, not as a whole society. They didn't return to the worship of foreign gods. And yet, Joel still accuses them in this time of godlessness. And it's because godless means not acknowledging God. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're acknowledging something or some other being as God. It just means that you are not acknowledging God. They had become apathetic about their faith. And you can see how this can happen. You can see how this can happen very easily. So much of what we have to do in our lives has to do with just common everyday needs. We go, if you're a young person, you're a student, you go to school and your life centers around making sure that you pass your classes and you get good grades and you're setting yourself up for, a future college experience or a future job or a future career. And if you're an adult, maybe your focus is taking care of a household, or maybe your focus is taking care of your family by working a job and making money and making dinners, and all of these things that we have to do throughout our lives, they can consume us to the point that, we don't necessarily feel like we need God for the moment-to-moment things in our lives. That we can become so caught up in those things that it really just feels like something that you're doing on your own, and you go through most of your day until your alarm goes off on Sunday morning in godlessness. And this was a problem for the Second Temple Jews, that they were going through the motions. They were living their lives. There was work to be done in the land. They were rebuilding the city walls of Jerusalem. They were rebuilding their farmlands. They were rebuilding their economy. They were really just trying to become a nation of people again. And they became apathetic as to the presence of God, as to the very purpose of God's chosen people, Israel. They had lost that, so that they were living as effectively a secular nation. And it's for this that they come under judgment. Now, you'll notice in that judgment that I read that it's a plague of locusts that comes upon them. And that's kind of interesting, because historically, we're not really sure that a plague of locusts ever actually happened. I think that this is a vision that Joel had that he's recounting to them. It's a warning of a future plague that is coming, whether literal or figurative, in this plague of locusts. But he does ask this rhetorical question that I think is really interesting. It seems rhetorical when you read it, but I'm not sure if it is. He says, has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? In other words, have you forgotten, remember Joel's name is Yahweh is God. Have you forgotten that Yahweh is God? Have you become apathetic towards the reality that Yahweh is God? and come under judgment for that. Does that ring a bell for anybody? A time when somebody didn't confess that Yahweh was God and they came under judgment of Yahweh with the plague of locusts. Does that ring a bell for anyone? Come on. What is it? Egypt. Yeah, Pharaoh and the 10 plagues of Egypt. He refused to admit that Yahweh was God. In every way, he was trying to elevate the Egyptian gods as higher. He wouldn't recognize Yahweh as God, and he wouldn't let the people of Israel go to worship him. And therefore, him and the nation of Egypt came under many plagues, one of them being a plague of locusts that ate all of their lands and starved the people. There's an interesting inversion on this. In Leviticus 11:22, you actually get this idea that eating locusts is good. It's a good thing. And that might be weird to us, but I know that locusts and other, katydids and stuff like that and grasshoppers, they're high in protein, okay? They're actually really good for you. And eating large bugs was actually common in the ancient world. I guess you want to eat the big ones so you don't have to eat as many. But that was a common thing in the ancient world, and locusts were something that people ate. And if you had lots of locusts, that's something you could do. You could eat the locusts, and that was considered a good thing. You would actually be really healthy if you lived on locusts for a while. You probably would be. They're high in protein. They're low carb. They're a great food. You put some salt, some chili on them. They're probably really good. Trey likes them. I'm not into it, but to each his own. But in the ancient world, this wasn't in any way weird. It was actually totally normal to eat locusts and grasshoppers and things like that. And so Leviticus, they're talked about as a good thing. And I love this inversion. Why do I talk about that? Because I love the inversion that when the Israelites are faithful to God, they're actually eating locusts. But when they become godless, the locusts begin to eat them, or to begin to eat their crops, their livelihood. And so that's what we have happening here in this judgment, is that the Israelites are losing, they're losing a great deal of their societal foundation, of their societal restraint. They're losing what their society was about because of their godlessness. Look at the second effect of the Israelites' godlessness. It's their social standing. Joel 1:5. Here, Joel says, "Wake up, you drunkards, and weep wail, all you wine drinkers." He goes on, because the sweet wine, for it has been taken from your mouth. And what's interesting here is he's not really... Now, drunkenness is condemned in the scriptures. But you may notice that wording, he's saying, "Wake up, you drunkards." He's not actually condemning their drunkenness. What he's actually saying is to wake up out of the drunken stupor, to get out of it, to sober up. And it's actually funny that he's commanding him to do that, because it looks like they don't actually have a choice. If a plague of locusts comes into a land like Israel is an agrarian society. Everything that they do, even their international trade, is based in this time, not necessarily today, but in this time, even their international trade is based in agriculture. And so all of their crops are eaten by the locusts. All of their fruit trees, all of their vines, everything is eaten by locusts, so that there's nothing to eat. So you go, okay, well, we'll eat the animals. Well, you better hurry up and eat the animals before the animals starve to death, because there's nothing for the animals to eat. And effectively, the cutting off of the grain supply and the agriculture cuts off their entire internal stability, because now they can't eat. They're starving to death because even their animals are starving to death. And now their trade is cut off, so they can't trade for food with other countries because all they have is food. And now they have nothing. And so there's social ramifications for it. It goes further in Joel 1:9-10. Joel says, "Grain and drink offerings have been cut off from the house of the Lord, the priests who are ministers of Yahweh." So now even the priests in the temple can't offer the sacrifices that they're supposed to. And there's an internal irony in this. The grain and the drink offerings, which would be like grains formed into cakes that they would burn, and they would eat some and they would burn some, and wine that they would pour out on the fire of the altar. These were things that they added to the guilt sacrifices as a thanksgiving offering. So they would pour out these grain and drink offerings on the altar as a way of thanking God for his vast provision. But then the irony of this is they can't offer those because God isn't actually providing. He's not providing because of the godlessness, and therefore they cannot even step in to acknowledge God as they were to do beforehand. They've lost their entire ability, the priesthood has, to offer the sacrifices that they're supposed to offer. And then he goes to the farmers in Joel 1:11 and 12. He says, "Be ashamed, you farmers. Wail, you vine dressers, over the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished." And now he's getting to the source of the thing. That even the farmers, they're supposed to go out and work their fields. They're supposed to go out and do the harvest. They're supposed to go out and plant and route the waters and all of these things that they did in order to sustain the agriculture of Israel. And even the farmers can't do that. And so then the priesthood is suffering and the people are suffering. And they're so destitute that even the drunkards can't find a drop. I mean, you have to understand how great this poverty is. This is a poverty, this is a hunger unlike anything that you have ever experienced. This is like just think about the drunkards for a minute, just to put this in context. You know, if you were to go to prison, hypothetically, please don't, but if you were to go to prison, there's not supposed to be any alcohol in prison, right? So if ever anybody needed to get clean, that should be the place to go. And yet they get really clever making weird kinds of alcohols out of like pieces of bread that they sneak and ketchup packets and stuff like that. And they make this horrible tasting, assuming, like alcoholic drink out of like the nastiest things. Look, it's so bad in Israel that they can't scrape together enough carbs to ferment in any single way in order to make something. And so they have no choice. Wake up, you drunkards. Get out of your drunken stupor, because guess what? There's no alcohol for you to drink anywhere in the entire land. That is how bad this famine is. That is how bad this hunger is. This is what the plague of locusts is causing to Israel. And so there are social ramifications to it. It is a judgment of God upon them. And third, there's actually a generational consequence to it. There's a generational consequence to it. Look at Joel 1:3. Joel says, "Tell your children about this, and let your children tell their children, and their children to the next generation." Look, we're a storied culture, whether you realize it or not. Our society thrives on story. It's driven by story. Whatever narrative it is that you're choosing to believe, it is motivating the decisions that you make throughout your life. The ancient world was no different. Their stories were important. And stories like the Exodus, where they had a very similar narrative to this one about how the Egyptians refused to acknowledge Yahweh as God. Joel, Yahweh is God. And therefore they came under this great judgment. That's a story that they were supposed to be telling. In Deuteronomy 6, they are commanded to tell these stories to the next generation and to the next generation so that they do not forget. Our history exists so that we don't forget. Remember 9/11, never forget, right? And yet, most of the time, let's be honest, we forget. But that's the reality. We're supposed to tell these stories so that we don't forget. And yet somehow, the Israelites, it seems, at this point in their history, stopped telling the right stories. They stopped believing the right things. They stopped believing that Yahweh, their God, was behind every provision that they received. And they started to think that the work that they did and the produce that they produced was the work of their own hands. And that was a problem. That's godlessness. You say, no, that's just a good hard work ethic. And Joel says, no, that is godlessness. When you don't recognize God working in and through all things. And so then, because they weren't thinking about that, they're not teaching it to their children. And therefore, their children aren't thinking about the presence of Yahweh in all things. And they're not teaching it to their children. This is what it means that judgment is delivered to the second and the third generation, by the way. Because what you fail to do, to speak into your children, they will fail to speak into theirs. And it's the reality of it. But the blessing of it is that what you do speak into your children, they will speak into theirs. At least to the second and the third generation. And then we go through life thinking that like our decisions, the way that we live our lives, my worldview, it's just my business and it doesn't affect anybody else. And while I think in the last point, as we considered the social ramifications of the godlessness of Israel, that's kind of this widthwise, right? This idea that like the way I live, whether I want to admit it or not, it affects everybody around me. And the way you live, whether you want to admit it or not, it affects everybody around you. There's a horizontal effect, but there's also a vertical effect that it affects your children and it affects your children's children. You're never as alone as you think. The things that you do, they affect more than you realize. And so Israel's stories, they were supposed to remind people, Yoel, Joel, Yahweh is God. And they weren't doing it. And there were generational consequences that would come to a peak in this day of the Lord moment when literally or figuratively locusts come in to consume all things.